Welcome to the EFC's webinar on what churches can and cannot do during a federal election. My name is Karen Stiller. This webinar is designed to help you navigate through what lies ahead for the country in the next few months and for you to send in your questions. We have two expert guests with us today, Deina Warren, legal counsel for the Canadian Council of Christian Charities, and Julia Beazley, Director of Public Policy for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. So welcome to both of you, and I'm going to begin by asking you to share a little bit more about your work and your expertise in this area. Deina, would you lead us off?
Sure. Thank you, Karen, for having me. So I have been a lawyer for quite some time. Most of my experience is in the religious freedom constitutional law area. I've recently joined the Canadian Council of Christian Charities as their Associate Director of Legal Affairs. And so I'm relatively new to the charities law sector, but certainly not to the faith sector. And what we do at 4Cs is we provide resources, guidance, and best practices to charities so that they can operate in an exemplary, healthy, and effective way, as our mission statement says. And certainly how to navigate behavior and conduct in elections is one of those areas.
Wonderful. Julia. And you are muted, Julia.
I'm muted.
There you go. Good.
Am I unmuted now?
You are. I did the same thing, so it's all good.
I'm Director of Public Policy here at the AFC, not of technology. And so we kind of work around in these issues all the time. We are always engaging in what the Canada Revenue Agency calls public policy dialogue and development activities. So we're sort of familiar with what the lines are between partisan and political activity and so on. And we've recently developed, in preparation for the upcoming election, sort of a toolkit to be made available for evangelicals. That's on our website, and we may refer to it now and then throughout the webinar. But it's designed to help evangelicals think through the issues. What does it mean to engage in the political process, and what are some of the issues we might want to talk about and things we might consider doing?
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And just a reminder to people who are watching this webinar, send in your questions at any time, depending on what platform you're using to watch it. The way to do that will be different, but it should be obvious, and we welcome your questions. So first off, what is at risk for churches if they don't follow the guidelines that we're about to explore? What is the worst thing that can happen? Deina?
Well, essentially, you can be penalized by the CRA. There are also some potential penalties under the Canada Elections Act. So often this includes sanctions. There's a nice little chart on the CRA website that will tell you the penalty for the first infraction of devoting resources to opposing or supporting political parties or candidates would be 1 year, for example, 1 year suspension of your tax receiving privileges. And subsequent infractions would have similar or increased penalties. So there's certainly that you're risking.
And is this something that happens often, Deina, that you're aware of, or is it pretty rare?
Certainly since my time at 4Cs, I haven't been aware. I do recall a number of years ago in the news media encountering a story about a church, I believe in the western part of Canada, who eventually had its charitable status revoked. But that was also under a different regime where political activities of charities was greatly restricted to about 10% of resources. That whole regime has changed in the past year, and I'm sure as we go along we can unpack that change in the regime a little bit. As Julia mentioned at the outset, this idea of public policy and dialogue development is relatively new to the church and charity sector, and it really has opened up the doors for engagement in that way.
For like a healthy engagement, you mean that churches can be involved in some ways?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so Julia, can you walk us through briefly what churches can do, what it's okay for churches to do, and maybe even good for them to do?
Sure. I think, first and foremost, we would say that churches can pray. I think we pray for our country, for the candidates and their families, and for wisdom on how to vote. How do we decide which is the best fit for us and which candidate we think is the one we should be voting for? But there's a lot of things that churches can do to both encourage people to participate in the political process and also to help them become informed. Churches, for example, can talk about the privilege and responsibility of voting. of living in a democratic society and this ability that we have to participate in our political process. We can talk about why participating in the public square matters. But sort of beyond those general things, we can provide information to our congregation about issues of concern. What are the issues of the day? How do we orient ourselves to them biblically? What is our view, or what position might we take on different issues? And certainly we're free to express our views on issues of concern and invite others to do so, so long as we don't tie that position to a particular party or candidate. And one of the things we can also do is to plan an all candidates meeting. This is something we can do sort of as an individual church in partnership with other churches, or even with other community groups, community centers and associations and so on. So this is a forum where you would invite all of the local candidates to come and present their views on a range of issues. You'd invite the community in. So that can be a really neat exercise.
And do churches do that? In all my years in a Canadian church, I've never personally seen that happen. Is that something that churches actually do?
I haven't heard of a lot of cases among evangelical churches doing this. Certainly something I think we would encourage, because it's a great opportunity to serve your community, to get to know your community, and also to get to know the candidates. So here is this group of people. One of them is going to be elected to be your representative. It's a great opportunity to sort of make that connection before they take office, and then you have to contact them down the road when there's an issue or a concern. I think churches may be more inclined to sort of rent their space for this kind of event rather than host it themselves. But I think it's something worth exploring and can be a great benefit to both the church and to the community. It also says we can present ourselves and participate in our community in this way that is helpful and constructive and nonpartisan. And that sets a really good tone going forward, I think, also.
So presumably, if you were hosting an all-candidates meeting, you would be doing it for more than just your church congregation, probably. You'd invite the larger community in. And Deina, what if you had this going on at a church and the rule is that all the candidates are supposed to be there and someone cancels at the last minute? Are you then violating one of the guidelines, or how does a church handle that?
No, if the church has extended the invitation to all of the candidates and one candidate declines to participate, CRA doesn't view that as then becoming support or opposition for one political party or another. The only thing that I would say about that is when you are organizing it and are planning it, do it in good faith, right? We want to have a good witness as well. I mean, we always want to bear in mind that we are operating as churches and we have a gospel witness to maintain and integrity. And so we want to ensure that we aren't sending out last minute invitations, kind of, hoping one or two may not be there. We want to show good faith and genuine interest in the process and in being compliant, right? So you want to make sure that you have lots of time. Make sure you invite all of the candidates, express an equal willingness to host them at your debate. And frankly, I would actually keep records of all of that communication just as your church. So if CRA does ask you any questions, you can say, well, look, this is the date that we planned it. This is when we invited the candidates, and these are the acceptances, and these are the individuals who declined the invitation.
Okay. And then also, I was just thinking the big picture view also in this is that evangelicals in particular, to talk about that faith community, us, we don't vote as one block of people anyway. I mean, there are people in our churches who would vote for all the parties, and we need to presume that. Correct, Deina?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree. Certainly there are a lot of gray areas in this. I think Julia talked about that earlier, and the need for prayer and wisdom and discernment. A lot of this comes down to conscience and conviction, and it may not be at the core of what we share as evangelicals and in our churches, some of these political matters. And so, yeah, we do need to be mindful of that. Absolutely.
Okay, good. And we do have some questions coming in, which is great. So here's a very good question. If a member of a church is a candidate, what can he or she do or not do? So you've got someone in your church running for the election. Julia, what can they host coffee hour?
So I think sort of the basic rule is you cannot engage in any activity that appears partisan. So unfortunately, Deina can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is, especially if it's a member of your own congregation where there's going to be sort of that built-in bias and favor. I think you have to be really careful. Now, you can absolutely have that person speak, but again, as Deina said, it has to be in a setting and a forum at a time where all of the candidates have been given the same opportunity. They're given the same notice, they're sent the same invitation. Again, we're not responsible for whether or not they all decide to come, but we are responsible for making sure we provide a level playing field for all of the candidates. It's tricky, because you want to support the people but we can still do that. We just have to make sure that in whatever setting we decide to do that, we are really being careful to extend the same opportunity to the other candidates as well.
Okay. Deina, anything to add to that?
I agree with what Julia said. Charities can't use resources for the purposes of supporting or opposing a political candidate or political party. So if this person wants to host coffee hour, the fair market value rental fee, for example, like churches can rent their space, but they have to do it on an equal basis. So if they want to allow their internal church member candidate free coffee hour, one, I wouldn't do that in the first place, but you would need to essentially allow every candidate to do that. And even in terms of renting at fair market value, you have to be careful if it's someone who is already very closely associated with the church, because I'll just double check. I just want to make sure I get the terminology right here.
Thank you.
In terms of rental, I wrote down a note. One, you check your rental policy. First of all, does your rental policy even allow your church to rent in that circumstance? So that's the key, that's the first step, absolutely, is to make sure that you are aligning with your rental policy on that. And then the other thing is...
Deina, go ahead, please, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, while you look it up, another question which I think can be answered maybe quickly is, we're talking about churches, and that is primarily what this webinar was about, but do these rules also apply to Christian charities or religious charities that are registered?
I don't know if Julia wants to speak to that.
Sure,
but
go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, so these rules apply to all registered charities. So we're talking about churches, most of which are registered charities, but the same rules would apply. If you are a registered charity, you are subject to the same rules.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that, thank you for the moment there, Karen. So as long as you're charging fair market value, you can rent to a party or candidate for occasional meetings. It becomes questionable if the charity is reluctant or unwilling to rent to all parties or candidates.
Okay.
There's a frequent and continued association between the two that could lead to a conclusion that the church or charity is favoring that party or candidate. And so that would be the main concern if you have if someone from your church body and you're allowing them to rent your facility.
Okay. And so it would be essential that they rent it, first of all. And then you need to make sure that if someone else called you to rent it, you would do that.
Yes, because you can't use your resources to support or oppose a political candidate or party.
Okay. Another question from a participant: can a church refer to bills by name or number and explain what is contained in a bill? Can a pastor encourage the congregation to write or phone their MPs regarding their opinion on that bill? Julia?
Yes. That's the short answer, but yes. So that is considered a legitimate public policy dialogue and development activity. So we can inform about issues, we can inform about legislation that we like, that we don't like, what we think of it. Again, what we cannot do is tie that to a particular position of a party or a candidate. So we can even, let's say there was a bill that didn't pass in the last parliament and it was going to come up in the next one, and we want to have a sense of who voted how. So we could post the voting records of all MPs from all parties. And that means we sort of can't, we can post it equally so people can see how the different parties align, how the different members align on a particular issue, but we can't go through and say, so that means no like red X's beside the ones we don't like or green check marks beside the ones we do. The information has to be presented in a neutral fashion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Deina, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree.
Okay.
You can't be identifying individual candidates, politicians, or parties. The issues are fair game.
Yeah. And that's something the EFC does quite frequently, is we encourage people to contact their MP, and we, help educate Canadians about what's behind some issues to help them do that better. So another question, this is an interesting one from somebody from a pregnancy care center. With the movie Unplanned being released this summer, and that sort of goes behind the scenes of abortion clinics, if I'm understanding that film correctly. It has been controversial so far in Canada, especially. There's discussion between our center, so a pregnancy care center, and churches who want to organize a viewing of it. So this isn't just a CRA question, but also sort of an image question. But do you have any comments on that from the CRA or political perspective? This crisis center tries to be neutral in how they present to the community, of course, and in their care for women. And also it seems likely that the topic of abortion may become part of the upcoming election too, and we can probably assume that. So Deina, any advice for a pregnancy care center in getting involved with the viewing of this sort of controversial film that gets people so upset?
I mean, I don't necessarily see this as a particularly election-related issue or a partisan concern, unless you start tying it to a certain political party's position, right? Like, you can talk about pro-life issues, you can talk about abortion, you can talk about preborn human rights, again, as a policy issue and as it aligns with your charitable objectives. So as long as those activities are within that scope, seems to me that it's a reasonable pursuit for that particular charity.
Okay. Julia, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just, I think it is something to prayerfully consider, just in light of sort of other issues that could arise. I'm just guessing that maybe something like Canada Summer Jobs is in the back of the mind in asking this question.
Right, that could be.
So, there is that kind of consideration, like I think the questioner talked about. Is there an image question? And that is really something, prayerfully consider whether you want to proceed with that or not.
Yep, that's good and fair advice. Another question, do these same guidelines apply to publications that have charitable status in terms of the content they publish? Julia?
Sorry, what was that again?
If you're a publication, so presumably a magazine, maybe it's a denominational magazine.
Yeah.
I don't have that detail, but so do these same guidelines apply if your magazine has a charitable status?
I think we're going to start to sound a little bit repetitive, but again, the same thing. If you have a publication or literature and you're a registered charity, then that publication cannot be used to favor or oppose a particular candidate or party. Something we don't often think of, which I came across as I was preparing for this, is that we also have to be careful if we have, say, a Facebook page or a blog or some sort of online platform where the public are able to comment. We are actually responsible for moderating that content and making sure that really partisan comments are not appearing there, and we have to take them down if they do. So we do have to be mindful of, again, it is legitimate to talk about issues. It's legitimate to talk about what we think about the issues. It's legitimate to talk about laws and policies and how we feel about them. But the line is we cannot tie those things to a particular party or candidate.
Okay. The next question leads beautifully from your comment, Julia, because it's about social media. So if you're a pastor, what guidelines should a pastor follow for political comments on social media? So let's presume that this question has to do with both your church's own social media, but also you as an individual and your profession is a minister. Deina, can you tackle that?
Sure. Well, just to underline what Julia said, in terms of the church itself, if it has a social media platform, it does have to monitor for partisan comments and remove them. Now, because you're part of an organization that's charitable or church, it doesn't preclude you from engaging in political activity on your personal time, or partisan activity on your personal time. However, this is an area that I would describe as cautionary, particularly when you're in very public position of leadership, such as a pastor. If you are going to be involved in politics on your personal time, you need to make that line very clear. So you need to state, if you're making a public statement in a political arena, for example, that this is your personal view and not the views of the organization that you work for. Same with social media. Like, I think it's very important to make that delineation between your personal comments and your organizational or professional comments. Very clear. You don't want to put your organization or your church at risk for partisan activities. So that's something that's not only important for leaders, but also for the leaders to disseminate within the organization, so that everyone who's part of that organization is also aware of that and aligns with the guidelines from CRA on that.
Okay. A nice follow-up question to that. We have a church pastor asking us that they're also a campaign manager as a private citizen of a federal candidate. So here's a pastor who, in his off time or whatever, is a campaign manager. If I don't use church resources, the pulpit, church email, anything in the role of the campaign manager, I should be okay, correct? Julia?
Yes, I'll see if Deina has anything to add, but my understanding is yes. So the key is church resources. Don't use the photocopier, the paper, the phone, the church computers, the church email addresses, anything like that. So long as it is kept completely separate, you're using your personal email address, your personal time, your personal resources. You are completely free as an individual to support a candidate, to campaign for them, to volunteer for them. Does that sound right, Deina?
Yes, I would agree. I think just being very careful and aware that you aren't dipping into those resources, even in your time. When you're expected in your regular role at work to be working, don't use that time to engage in partisan activities. Even if it's just emailing for that purpose, I would set that aside. You don't want to compromise the integrity of your church to engage in partisan activities. So just to underscore and highlight and reinforce everything that you just said.
Yeah. So it sounds like being overly cautious would be the best way to go on this. Any special considerations for charities on social media? For example, could you share a video of what one candidate says about an issue? How do you practice a level playing field in social media? I think we've touched on that, but Deina, how do you respond to that?
What I think might be perhaps better than just one video, because if you're only explaining or giving a platform to one candidate, whether it's in support or opposition, that would, in principle, in my view, probably run afoul of the intention of the guidelines. I think maybe what would be better is to post the policy position of each of the candidates or each of the parties on that particular issue. Or if you can't find it, then you are allowed to ask the parties and candidates that question. So you can ask them the question what the party position is on it, and you can share that response. But you just, again, as Julia said before, in terms of voting records, you just need to present the full picture and not highlight different colored check marks.
Okay, so somebody asked, can we report the voting history for the reproductive rights motion in Parliament back in May? So, Julia, I'm guessing the answer is yes to that.
As long as you report how everybody voted.
Yes.
Again, and not highlighting anything particular in the data. Just, you can report, voting records are public. You can see them in Hansard, the way they vote on anything and everything. So that information is public, and we can include that. We just can't sort of, we can't provide too much commentary on how this, any commentary on how this or that MP or party voted on something. But we can present the information for people to look at themselves and to go through.
Okay. Deina, someone is asking, I think, a follow-up to what we were talking about with a church pastor being careful not to use church resources. And this clever question, are the members themselves considered resources?
I mean, it depends on, so you can have monetary resources, but you also have volunteer hour resources, for example. And so if you're using Charities resources in that way, like, for example, if you're using the church as a means to collect volunteers from the membership, I would stay away from that. If you are using your personal relationships that have developed within the church, but outside of the church, to ask them if on their own personal time they're willing to assist you. Again, I think that's different. I mean, we want to approach this with good intentions and in an ethical way, and we want to always have our standards above what is the minimum, right? And so I think anything that we can do to show that we're making that effort is good.
Okay. Someone is asking what's the exact section number of the statutes for saying that registered charities can't do partisan activities. So if a church or a charity wants to look this up themselves and find out, is it easily found?
Well, you can look up the provisions of the Income Tax Act if you'd like, or you can also check the CRA Charities website, and they have all of their guidance available for download and online reading there. Sometimes it's more helpful to read the guidance rather than the legislation, although I always encourage people to read legislation.
Well, you're a lawyer.
Exactly. It's just not everyone's cup of tea.
No.
So I got this one off a Government of Canada site. This is what the page looks like. I don't know if you can see that, but this is the guidance that I was talking about. It's called Public Policy Dialogue and Development Activities by Charities. So I think if you Google that, it was revised, as Deina said, this spring because the rules changed in terms of percentage of resources we can allot to these kinds of activities. So this is new and it's current, up to date. So it should be pretty easy to find. There is a reference number on it, which I'll give just in case that makes it helpful. It's CG-027.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if you'd like, just before we move on, the sections of the Income Tax Act, if we do have some very interested folks out there, it's the Income Tax Act and subsections 149.1. subsections 6.1 and 6.2.
Yeah, good. We received a letter a week or two ago here at the EFC, and I've actually had the same conversation with my 20-year-old daughter saying, why are we sort of caving into these sorts of, requirements and so on? And I guess that my question is, if a church or a charity did not want to abide by these guidelines, can they just, give up their charitable status? I guess that's, Deina, do people do that if they feel upset by these restrictions?
I mean, I think that's always a choice that a church or charity has to make. Obviously, they won't be a charity any longer,
right?
If they make that decision. But certainly, I think that comes back to some of the conscience and conviction issues that we were talking about at the outset of the webinar. And maybe some churches feel that they don't want to abide by these. And, if that's where the church lands and they feel that that's appropriate, then they can make that decision, and then they are able to engage on different terms during an election period or otherwise. But if we're choosing to have the benefit of issuing donation receipts and other benefits that come with being a charity, then we need to also accept these restrictions. I mean, my personal view is that so long as there isn't anything unbiblical about what we're being asked to do, then I think that we can, in good conscience, abide by it. Whether or not the church feels like they want to is another question. And if they want to engage on a different level, then they can re-examine their desire to stay under those provisions.
Okay. Julia, anything to add to that?
No, I agree. We would never say that we should or shouldn't have charitable status. That's up to each church and each charity to decide. prayerful consideration. But as Deina said, I don't know that there's a right way and a wrong way. I think that is up to the individual church and organization to discern what is best for them. But if we do want these benefits, we do have to play by the rules.
And every now and then you do hear a story in the media about a pastor saying something from the stage or whatever that seems like it would break the rules. I mean, what happens? Do they get reported? I mean, will they get a warning first? Like, it's pretty rare for a charity or a church to have their charitable status revoked, is it not, Deina?
Yeah, I mean, CRA will usually take let's encourage compliance. Let's show a willingness to change and that we understand, as opposed to we go straight to revoking charitable status. There are interim steps and sanctions that would be imposed first.
Okay. All right. We have more questions. So what about specific candidates whose manifesto or let's say position on something coincides with the church's goals? Are we even allowed to say a certain candidate has said such and such instead of mentioning a name? So I guess, can you beat around the bush in a tricky way? Or it feels to me that's like, why even go there? But what do you think, Julia?
I'll let Deina comment on the finer points of that. But again, she's spoken a few times to, there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. And that is sort of treating all of the candidates equally in how we talk about things leading into an election. And again, she spoke to our Christian witness. So we're not trying to get around the rules in any way. But in not mentioning a name, the challenge with that is that was obviously a public statement made. It would be pretty easy to figure out who said it, I think, even without mentioning a name. But maybe Deina has sort of a better perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to some of the repeated themes that we're talking about and trying to just focus on the issue itself. So if the comment helps, if the comment in isolation from the commenter can be kept within a discussion on the issue, it's so difficult because it's very fact-based and very contextual, right? So, even how it's the words that are used to explain the situation are important and relevant to kind of finding out where it lands. But I would agree with what Julia says, and we don't really want to try and tiptoe around these and try and weasel our way into saying things that maybe we shouldn't.
Okay.
But maybe we can just keep our focus on the issue more so than the people.
And I want to acknowledge that restriction is frustrating because I think it feels like increasingly candidates who may, for example, have pro-life views aren't getting a fair shake elsewhere. So it's really tempting to want to kind of give them, for example, if that's something we're passionate about, it's tempting to want to give them some profile and platform, but we just can't, we have to play by the rules. And that means we treat everybody the same in terms of the time we give to them, the time we give to their views, to their policies, their platforms, and so on.
Okay. We have several questions in about lobbying, so let's talk about that for a moment. So how the government has changed the rules around charity lobbying. Can we talk about that, Deina? And is it true that charities can now lobby? So if you could shed some light on the lobbying question, please.
Sure. Well, public policy and dialogue development does open the door. So it used to be that a charity could only spend 10% of its resources on political activities. And there were various tests that you would apply to determine whether or not an activity fell within that definition. Under public policy and dialogue development, charities can spend up to 100% of their resources engaging in them. Some of that will include lobbying, but what is defined as lobbying. So even though under CRA's regime, it's permissive now for that, you still have to abide by registration and reporting and all of the requirements under the various lobbying acts, federally and provincially. So just because you might have more scope to engage in that activity doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. You still have to abide by the lobbying rules.
And Julia, how about you? What do you have to say about churches and lobbying and charities? I mean, that's something we think about a lot here.
Yeah, so, I am registered as a lobbyist, and there are certain kinds of activities, mainly when it comes to pushing for a change to a law or policy, that I have to register. So there's a monthly process. We have to I had this phone call, this meeting, that kind of thing. But there are things like sending letters. If you want to send letters, that's not something that is allowable. If you want to make a written submission on a consultation or a hearing that's happening, you can do that. So it's just kind of learning where the reportable activities are, and what things are just open for anybody to do. But certainly, as a constituent, calling your MP and expressing your concerns on an issue, I think that is fair game. It's just, I don't know, Deina, can you explain the line between a constituent expressing concerns to their elected official and lobbying? How do we help people understand where that distinction is?
Refer them to the lobbying guidance. I mean, it really is important, as Julia is saying, to kind of be familiar with what falls under that category and what doesn't. As an individual, as Julia is saying, I mean, it's like what we were talking about before. An individual church member can engage in all sorts of partisan political activities. An individual church member can knock on their MP's door multiple times a week and call and do that sort of thing as an individual. So there is a lot of freedom there. It's just when you move into the organizational and representing the interests of your charity or church. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Julia. It's hard to define the lines really clearly in a really summary way.
Yeah. But so we know as private citizens, we can contact whatever MP we want, whenever we want, about whatever topic we want. But when you're, the pastor of a church, or what happens inside the church and charity, is what we're referring to here, I guess. What if you're a pastor and someone comes up, a parishioner asks you how you're going to vote, which would be maybe something that wouldn't happen, but stranger things have happened. Would that pastor be allowed to share that, Deina?
I think this is a question of discretion for the pastor,
Okay.
Based on, is it a personal relationship and this person's coming for spiritual advice because they want to know, as a believer, this is what they're struggling with, and they're looking for some spiritual guidance on how to reconcile some of these convictions and concerns. If they're looking to tweet something out, This is what my pastor says, then it might be I would maybe answer a little bit differently if I were in that role. But certainly, I ask people, we have conversations about politics, and you can discuss in sort of that interpersonal way.
Mm-hmm.
Again, personal, organizational.
Okay.
I'm not talking to you as a friend. I'm not talking to you as the pastor of this church and advising you as the pastor of this church what to do in the election.
Yeah, that's good. Question about do these restrictions apply to Christian radio stations, which are charitable as well? Are there other obligations under the CRTC about being nonpartisan? Do you know about? So first of all, this applies to Christian radio stations, Julia, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And are there other obligations under the CRTC about being nonpartisan? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I think most of that gets covered under the CRA guidelines, the Elections Act, lobbying, and so on. I'm not aware of anything in the CRTC Act.
Okay. Can an organization send a letter to your MP or the PM, Deina?
Well, as Julia was saying earlier, if you're and this was the same under the previous regime, actually, for charities. If you're engaging in a public consultation process, and the records are public, you can send letters. You can, if you were testifying, for example, before a committee, you're allowed to do that as well.
Okay.
It's part of the public record.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have further comments, Julia.
No, I'm just thinking it might be helpful for us to sort of look at where that point is where you have to talk about reporting your lobbying activities. And I don't know the answer right now, but I'm wondering if that's something that might be helpful for us to spell out a little more clearly, because the question seems to be coming up. So maybe we can do that and post it afterwards or something to make that available for people.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So we can, people watching this can watch for a blog or something on the EFC site as well. And I know the 4Cs obviously offers a lot of resources on this. I want to come back to a question that I think keeps coming up in different forms. So if in the daily life of a church, if the candidate is a member, can they speak one-on-one with the members in an informal setting? I presume that this question is about in the church. So it's coffee hour and you're a candidate and you're at your church and people are asking you questions about the election. Can you talk there freely, Deina?
If you are there as an individual church member and you are not using this space to campaign, if someone comes and asks you a question one-on-one, or and you're just having a natural conversation like you would on any other topic during coffee hour, I wouldn't see that as partisan activity by the church itself. If the church is saying to the candidate, please use coffee hour to tell everyone about your candidacy and your party, that's different. But in individual interpersonal conversations, I mean, I don't even know how you could begin to regulate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We did hear once of someone setting up a table in the church foyer to sort of sign up party memberships and so on. So that kind of thing is clearly over the line.
Right.
So as long as Deina said, as it's not being said, hey, so-and-so is going to be in the foyer during coffee hour, talk to them, just have to use wisdom in how these things happen. But people are free to have conversations and exchanges. You just can't be formally providing any sort of platform for that.
Now, what about letters to the editor in a printed newspaper? Do pastors and board members of a church or a charity have to refrain from being nonpartisan, even if they're writing as individual citizens? Deina?
As individual citizens, if you're going to engage in that, in sort of personal partisan activity, you need to be very careful about how you represent yourself. If you are speaking about an issue and your church is concerned and you can keep it to the issue without identifying any political candidate or political party, that's, again, a different scenario. But if you want to, in a letter to the editor, talk about candidates and parties, you need to make it clear that you're speaking on your own personal behalf and not on behalf of your charitable organization.
Okay. What if you're a church, can you recommend, say, a website that helps, and the website itself is partisan? Let's say it helps Christians find out which parties candidates have platforms that are in line with Christian values. Likely these websites will put some in a negative light and some in a positive. So can the church point people to a website that maybe breaks their rules for them? Julia?
I would say no. I would say no.
Okay. In our last election, there was a candidate who came to our church and asked our pastor to support her and put his name as the pastor of this church on her promotion materials. Should that be avoided? I'm going to answer yes. Just after listening to this webinar. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So some things, I mean, it seems to me there are some things that are really super clear, yes and no. And then there's that murky middle where common sense can sometimes be the guide, or defaulting on the caution. Is that what you think, Deina? As we come to a close and start wrapping up, What is your last word for people, for churches and charities as we move forward in the next few months?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things. One, the old saying, does it pass the sniff test? So, I mean, if you're really second guessing, I think that shows that maybe you really should be second guessing.
Okay.
Another thing I think that's really important, and we've talked about it a few times through this, is how will this improve or undermine my gospel witness, right? We really want to be faithful in the public square. So I do think that that's a really important question. And then also just make yourself aware, like there are a lot of resources available, even through CRA, some of which we've referred to today, that can be very helpful. They do try to make them in plain language. So one, inform yourself to just make sure that you think you're doing it above board. And another question to ask is if you saw an organization that maybe has completely opposite views to yours and they were engaging in the behavior that you're considering, would you see that as appropriate or ethical, or would you have any concerns about that? So consider how it's being perceived by others, as particularly the CRA. So those are a few things that I think a group, a church, or a charity can ask themselves as they're looking toward election activities.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And Julia, just before I turn to you, Deina, are there resources on the 4Cs, Canadian Council of Christian Charities website that you'd like to draw people's attention to?
Sure, absolutely. So we do have various blog posts that are available to the public. The Noteworthy blog is one that I maintain and try to provide resources and links to resources for our churches. And then for our members, we do have bulletins. And certainly in the next July and September, I have a 2-part series on elections restrictions, political activities.
Okay, very good. And I'm just curious, after participating in this webinar with many, many questions, will this shape some of the blogs that we'll see from you in the next couple of weeks, maybe?
Yeah, you know what? Our goal is to try and help charities and churches figure out how to navigate these lines and be compliant and effective. So certainly I'll take a lot of these questions under advisement for those.
Excellent. Julia, any last words for people and guidance?
Yeah, I just, I know a lot of this can seem daunting, but I really want to encourage people to not be discouraged by all of the rules and all of the minefields, potential minefields. I think it's really important for us to engage in public policy and in the political process. It's one of the ways that we can help to shape and influence our society. And it's an essential part of our witness, as Deina said. If we're not there, we can't sort of help shape and engage with our society in the same way. I think it's one of the ways that we can work to reform the systems and structures in our society that create or perpetuate injustice. It's a way for us to sort of speak and uphold biblical principles in public policy and in the different conversations that are happening in our nation. So to uphold care for the vulnerable, the dignity and sanctity of all human life, religious freedom. So just to be encouraged, and hopefully what we have provided today gives you enough of an understanding so that you can proceed, again, as Deina said, with wisdom and with caution in areas, but also confident to talk about the issues. And these are the things we are concerned about. This is what we believe to be a biblical perspective on these issues, and then people can inform themselves accordingly and decide which candidate or which party best aligns with what they believe and what they think is the best fit for them. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a toolkit on our website. It has a variety of resources, including sort of a detailed outline of how to hold an all candidates meeting if anyone feels particularly inspired after this webinar to try and do that. There's a short summary of do's and don'ts and some issue fact sheets. So if you have a candidate come to your door, or you do host an all candidates meeting and you want to ask questions on a range of issues, we provided just sort of quick summaries and what are some questions you might ask of them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. This is obviously a topic of great interest and concern, so thank you for joining us from wherever you are today. Julia mentioned the EFC election kit available at the efc.ca. The July-August issue of Faith Today magazine, which the EFC publishes, will also have a couple of articles of interest to do with this topic. In September, we're hoping to have a webinar where we speak with some retired MPs to get some insights from them as well. If we did not get to your question today, or if you have other questions that come up later, please contact us. You can send them to me if you want at senioreditor@faithtoday.ca, and I will make sure they get to Julia and Deina. So, and this webinar will be posted, and you can share it later to freak out more people. No, we should not be overly concerned, right, Deina? We should engage enthusiastically in our systems.
I totally agree, and I'm glad Julia emphasized that. I think we do need to have a Christian voice and maintain that Christian voice in the public square.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.